The Legend of Zelda is a series of games that features a fantastic blend of action, puzzle solving, and exploration. Even after 30 years, many still consider The Legend of Zelda to be one of the best series of games in existence. The first game in the series was released on the NES in 1986. You play the game as Link, who has to recover the missing fragments of the Triforce of Wisdom in order to stop Ganon and save Princess Zelda. The goal of the game was to travel to the 8 dungeons placed throughout the overworld in order to find the pieces of the Triforce. Each dungeon is a labyrinth of interconnected rooms that requires you to solve some puzzles and to fight monsters in order to make progress. While you're traversing the dungeon, you'll also find items that will help you beat the game. Some of them are required for dungeons later in the game, but most of them are completely optional. Every piece of the Triforce is protected by a very tough enemy that acts as a boss fight, and killing them gives you a heart container to upgrade your maximum health. While the dungeons have numbers assigned to them, you can actually complete the game in whatever order you wish. The game drops you in a giant world, and the challenge is to discover all the secrets hidden within it. Even the simple act of getting your sword is a secret that is completely optional. While the game is pretty simplistic by modern standards, it was very advanced for the time. You were even able to save your progress and continue playing the game later, which is one of the first games to ever have this feature. It's one of the only NES games that was able to stand the test of time. Even today, it's still fun to play through the game and explore the world at your own pace. Nintendo quickly released a sequel in 1987 called Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. A few years after defeating Ganon, a sleeping spell was cast on Princess Zelda, and the only way to wake her up is to use the power of the third Triforce sealed away at the Great Palace. Even though Ganon has been defeated, his minions are still going after Link, since they can use Link's blood to bring Ganon back to life. The goal of the game is similar to the previous game in the series. Link has to make his way to 6 dungeons hidden throughout Hyrule, break the seal placed on the Great Palace, and obtain the Triforce of Courage. The game features a brand new side-scrolling perspective that is unique to this game. You navigate the world in a similar fashion as the previous game, but the game will switch to a side-scrolling perspective whenever you fight an enemy or explore certain areas. Zelda 2 places a much bigger emphasis on the combat, with most of the game revolving around fighting enemies with your sword and shield. This is also the first game that introduces the use of magic, with most magic spells being used to navigate the world, as well as aid you during combat. One of the biggest additions to the game is the new leveling system. Killing enemies rewards the player with a certain amount of experience points, which you can use to increase your health, attack, or magic meter. Each stat costs a different amount of experience points to level up, with each one only having 8 levels. The real challenge of Zelda 2 is that the enemies no longer drop recovery hearts, which means the only way to heal yourself is to level up, use a magic spell, use a fairy, or travel to a town. To make matters even worse, you can easily lose a life from just falling down a pit. Getting a game over also brings you back to the beginning of the game, so some of the hardest challenges are just being able to travel to certain areas without getting a game over. One of the hardest parts of the game is just getting to the final dungeon. Like, I'm not even joking, even the simple act of just getting to the final dungeon is really fucking hard. I love it. It's the only game in the series that was ever like this, which sucks because the game's pretty fun. So now it's 1991, and Nintendo released the third game in the series, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This game came out on the SNES and switched back to the original top-down perspective of Zelda 1. Rather than continuing the story of the previous games, this game creates its own story that's completely independent. The goal of the game is to stop Aghanim from breaking the seal placed on the Sacred Realm. In order to do this, Link has to collect the 3 things by going to the first 3 dungeons in order to get the Master Sword, which opens up the Dark World, which then allows Link to go to 7 more dungeons to save the 7 maidens, which then allows him to kill Aghanim and eventually Ganon. The gameplay is very similar to the first game in the series, but with a ton of improvements. Link is now a lot easier to control with the ability to move diagonally. His sword also swings horizontally instead of a stab, which makes it easier to hit enemies. If you hold the B button and release it after a certain amount of time, you'll perform a spin attack, which has since become a staple of the series. The game also brings back recovery hearts from Zelda 1 and the magic meter from Zelda 2, which is only used for certain items. While heart containers are still given to the player for defeating bosses, the game also places pieces of heart throughout the world, and picking up 4 pieces of heart will create a heart container. This greatly increased the amount of secrets that players could find in the world, creating more incentive for players to explore. A major gameplay mechanic of A Link to the Past is traveling between the light and dark world using the magic mirror. You have to switch between the light and dark world to solve puzzles, as well as navigate certain areas blocked off in certain worlds. Dungeons have been vastly improved. Each dungeon features multiple levels ranging from 2 to 10, and big keys are required to open large chests that hold items, as well as opening opening the door to the boss room. More importantly, the dungeons in A Link to the Past were designed to use the items hidden inside. Each dungeon has a very consistent flow that works well with the items in the game. The start of the dungeon begins with the player trying to find the item inside. Then the player eventually finds the item and continues to make progress until they find the boss room. This fixes a major problem from Zelda 1 and 2, where players would end up fighting the boss before they were able to find the item. This would lead to situations where players would leave the dungeon, eventually get stuck, and realize that the item required to make progress is still in a previous dungeon. While I enjoy the open-ended nature of those games, I never really enjoyed backtracking through old dungeons. This streamlined approach in A Link to the Past prevents players from leaving the dungeon without important items. It also uses the items hidden within the dungeon to create some interesting puzzles, making each dungeon feel unique. A Link to the Past is one of the most beloved Zelda games, establishing the foundation of the series that later games would eventually improve on. 2 years later, Nintendo started to put out handheld Zelda games on the Game Boy, the first one being The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. It continued the return of the top-down perspective, which eventually became the standard for the handheld Zelda games. The story takes place right after Link defeated Ganon and regained peace in Hyrule. He decided to travel on a small sailboat, but his boat gets destroyed and he washes up on the shores like a Hoenn Island. In order for Link to get off the island, he has to wake up the Windfish by recovering 8 instruments scattered across 8 dungeons. It's one of the more bizarre premises for a Zelda game, but it's still just as fun as the other games in the series. Since Link's Awakening is completely removed from Hyrule, it gave the developers some leeway to make a more unique story and allow them to include some really bizarre cameos. The game features a ton of characters from other Nintendo titles, such as Yoshi, Kirby, Chain Chomps, Goombas, and all sorts of weird shit. With the freedom of being removed from Hyrule and being on a handheld console, the developers could basically do whatever they wanted. While this game was pretty experimental, it helped establish some of the core features of the handheld Zelda games, mainly the addition of Rock's Feather, which allows Link to jump in the air. This added some more action-oriented gameplay from a side perspective that hasn't been seen since Zelda 2. Link's Awakening is also the first game in the series that uses the ocarina to play songs. A Link to the Past introduced the ocarina as a flute, similar to the actual flute in Zelda 2, but this is the first instance where it's called an ocarina. This was also the first game in the series to introduce a lengthy trading sequence, where Link trades items between multiple characters until he receives a major reward at the end. Although this game came out right when I was born, I was able to play through the game as Link's Awakening DX, which was an enhanced version for the Game Boy Color. Overall, it's a pretty fun handheld Zelda game that's aged pretty well. So now it's 5 years later, and Nintendo released the first 3D Zelda game on the Nintendo 64. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It was one of the most highly anticipated games of its time that actually lived up to the hype. Ocarina of Time is essentially a reimagining of A Link to the Past, brought into 3D, with its story reinventing the major plot points of its predecessor. It reintroduces the Master Sword, the Triforce hidden in the Sacred Realm, and a somewhat different version of the Light and Dark World mechanic. While its more obvious plot points were inspired by A Link to the Past, there are also clear inspirations drawn from Link's Awakening, mainly the use of the ocarina, the owl that assists Link, the trading sequence, and some more subtle cameos from other Nintendo properties. The goal of the game is to stop Ganondorf from obtaining the power of the Triforce. In order to do this, Link has to collect the 3 things by going to the first 3 dungeons, which allows him to get the Master Sword, transporting Link 7 years in the future, where he has to go to 5 more dungeons to awaken the 7 sages, which allows him to finally kill Ganondorf. Bringing The Legend of Zelda into a 3D environment allowed the developers to branch out into new forms of gameplay. Now the player controls Link from a third-person perspective in a 3-dimensional world. Link will run in whatever direction you tilt the control stick, with the A button being used for contact-sensitive actions. Each action will change depending on what you're doing, which allows multiple actions to be mapped to one button. The ability to jump has also been simplified. Instead of using a jump button or Rock's Feather as an ability, Link will simply jump if you're running off a ledge. This simplified the movement by not having to deal with any platforming, moving most of the difficulty of traversing 3D space. While Link's movement is pretty simplified, the camera control is where Ocarina of Time excelled over its early 3D contemporaries. Anytime Link is in motion, the camera will usually move right behind Link and give you a good view of where he is. You can even change to a first-person perspective to look around and take in your surroundings. More importantly, you could immediately force the camera to move right behind Link by pressing the Z button. This means that you can always force the camera to look in whatever direction Link is facing, moving any need to freely control the camera. One of the revolutionary mechanics Ocarina of Time brought to the table was Z-targeting. When you're Z-targeting a monster, the camera will force Link and the monster to always be on screen. This also changes Link's movement to allow him to strafe around the enemy, with the A button being used to dodge attacks. mechanics. The major gameplay mechanic of Ocarina of Time is the time travel. After getting the 3 things, Link ends up getting the Master Sword, but this has the unintended effect of traveling 7 years into the future, where Ganondorf is taking over Hyrule. You spend a majority of the game playing as adult Link, but there are sections of the game where you have to return the Master Sword and play as child Link. Another major gameplay mechanic is using the Ocarina to solve puzzles. Unlike Link's Awakening, you have to play a song by pressing a certain combination of buttons. The A button and the 4 C buttons all correspond to a different note that can be played on the Ocarina, and once you play the first couple of notes, the song will play out in its entirety. While most developers were struggling to make the switch to 3D, Ocarina of Time was able to create an entire world in 3D space with minimal loading time, which was a huge deal for the time. Although there were choke points where the game had to quickly load in the next area, it all logically connected in a way that made sense. It was a breathing, vibrant world unlike anything you've ever seen. It was truly the first game in the series that felt like you were really in Hyrule. Nintendo 64 games have aged terribly, but Ocarina of Time was so above its contemporaries that it holds up incredibly well. It's nothing short of a fucking masterpiece. The game was quickly followed up in the year 2000 with The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Creating a sequel to the most critically acclaimed game of all time with a smaller development team in a year should have been a failure. Everything was stacked against Majora's Mask to be one of the most disappointing sequels in existence, but it was fucking awesome. Some people might even say that Majora's Mask was even better than Ocarina of Time. You play the game as Child Link after he defeated Ganondorf and returned the Master Sword to the Temple of Time. The goal of the game was to stop Skull Kid from crashing the moon into Termina and destroying the entire world. In order to do this, Link has to travel to the 4 dungeons in order to free the spirits of the giants trapped within. One of the major gameplay mechanics was the addition of the 3-day cycle. The entire game has a timer placed on the player until Skull Kid eventually crashes the moon into Termina. The only way to reset the 3-day cycle is to play the Song of Time on the Ocarina, which will reset the cycle and give you more time to complete the game. Every time you reset the cycle, you save your game and you get to keep all the items you've acquired, but you'll lose any progress you made with dungeons or side quests. This is one of the most controversial additions, since some players dislike the feeling of having limited time. While some players might feel like a slave to the clock, the game does a very good job at giving you a lot of checkpoints. Since you keep all your items when you go back in time, each item will allow you to skip over certain parts of the game that you've already played. The Ocarina also serves its purpose very well, since most of the songs you learn are also used to open up later dungeons. Once you get a specific item or Ocarina song, you can just reset the cycle without ever having to worry about losing progress. The dungeons are even designed to skip over previous areas once you get the specific item inside. This is why I don't understand why some people hate the 3-day cycle. Gives me the impression that most of these people have never really played the game at all. Maybe the time limit might stress some people out, but even then, if you just played the game, you'd realize it's not even a big deal in the first place. If you're entering a brand new dungeon on the 3rd day and you have no intentions of doing anything else, just fucking reset the cycle and do the dungeon on the first day, you fucking idiot! Maybe it's challenging for you to complete the dungeon within the full 3-day cycle, but you don't even have to do that! All you have to do is complete half the dungeon in order to get the item. Then you can just reset the clock and continue from where you left off. It's not even that big of a deal. One of the benefits of the 3-day cycle is that it made the characters feel very real. Many of the characters in the previous games would stand around the same place all day or maybe just walk back and forth on a set linear path. But Majora's Mask uses the 3-day cycle to bring these characters to life. Everyone in the game has their own schedule that they stick to throughout the 3 days in Termina, with each character having very specific interactions at certain parts of the day. Since you're constantly reliving the same 3 days over and over again, characters repeating dialogue and actions now has some in-game context that the previous games lacked. The game also has a much bigger emphasis on side quests, with each one fleshing out the personalities of the characters involved. Most of the side quests reward the player with masks, which is the other major gameplay mechanic that I really love. Each mask you find in the game has their own practical use, but the more important ones are the transformation masks. Over the course of the game, Link will be able to use certain masks to transform into a Deku Scrub, a Goron, or a Zora. Since each version of Link has their own abilities, they've been designed to also be used during specific dungeons in the game, which makes each dungeon feel extremely unique. The graphics for Majora's Mask have also been slightly improved with the use of the expansion pack. It was required to play Majora's Mask, so most people just got Donkey Kong 64 for the free expansion pack and threw that piece of shit in the garbage. One of the unique things about Majora's Mask was the darker tone. The constant threat of the moon crashing into Termina fills the entire game with a sense of dread unlike any game I've ever played. Seeing all the characters react react to their inevitable demise is incredibly jarring, and the game tackles some pretty mature themes for its E rating. While I love the darker tone of the game, a lot of the fanbase seems to have fetishized it over the years. You can look up some fan art of the game and see some of the most over-exaggerated imagery of suffering and despair that almost seems like a complete parody. You can still go online and read comments about how people essentially committed fucking suicide over how dark and depressing this game is. As someone who's played this game when they were about 8 years old, I think some of these people are being a bunch of fucking pussies. The game was never extremely depressing or sad. It was just a really fun video game. When I failed to reach Clock Tower at the beginning of the game and saw the moon crash into Termina, I didn't ball myself into a fetal position and slit my wrist while I cried and screamed in agony. I just said, oh, shit. Fucking died. A lot of people seem to have forgotten that this game is very subtle. The introduction of the game doesn't even tell you that the moon is going to crash into Termina. The only way you figure this out is by discovering it out on your own, and once you finally do, you can just look up and see the moon in all of its glory. Majora's Mask doesn't shove dark imagery down the player's throat so they can fucking cry about it. The game is just kind of weird and off-putting. You know, it's like a fucking mask. Masks aren't inherently dark or scary, but some people can still see them that way. It's not the actual mask that's scary, it's about what's hiding behind the mask that really sends chills down your spine. If I was a very soulless person, I had to objectively look at every game in the series and determine which one was the best in the grand scheme of things, Ocarina of Time would probably be the best Zelda game in the series. But as a fan of video games, as someone who enjoys video games as a medium, I would say that Majora's Mask is the best game in the series. It's a little too experimental to consider it one of the best Zelda games, but as a video game, it's unlike anything I've ever played in my life. The story is told very well, the mechanics are incredibly interesting, it has some of the best music of any video game I've ever played, and it's just a tight package. It's not too short, it's not too long, it leaves you wanting more, and it's fucking amazing. A year later, Nintendo released 2 games for the Game Boy Color, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. This is the era where Nintendo realized they could sell you the same fucking game 3 times and make a shit ton of money. It worked for Pokemon, so now they're doing it with Zelda. The incentive to buy both games was so you could use passwords to link both games into one linear story. Nintendo initially wanted to make 3 Oracle games because they clearly had the artistic vision of making a shit ton of money, but they were pressed for time. Instead, they basically created 2 games, and the final linked ending would lead into the events of Link's Awakening, thus completing the trilogy. Since all of these games play exactly the same, it kind of works out. The goal of Oracle of Seasons was to defeat a Nox by finding the 8 Essence of Nature scattered across 8 dungeons. The unique mechanic for this game was using the Rod of Seasons to switch between the 4 seasons, which allowed you to solve puzzles and navigate the overworld. The goal of Oracle of Ages was to defeat Varan by finding the 8 Essence of Time scattered across 8 dungeons. The unique mechanic for this game was using the Harp of Ages to switch between the past and the present, which allowed you to solve puzzles and navigate the overworld. While both games seem kind of similar, Oracle of Seasons focused more on action, while Oracle of Ages concentrated more on puzzles. The Oracle of Seasons takes place in Holodrum, while the Oracle of Ages takes place in Labrina, so each game has a different overworld and different dungeons. To put it simply, buying both of these games isn't a complete fucking scam. If I had to choose between each game, I would say I enjoy Oracle of Seasons more, just because it has a more interesting premise. There's nothing wrong with the Oracle of Ages, but the whole time travel mechanic is basically the same thing as A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, so it doesn't really stand out as much. Either way you see it, both games are still pretty fun to play. These were the first handheld Zelda games I played when I was young, and they're still worth checking out if you haven't played them yet. In 2002, Nintendo released a port of A Link to the Past on the Game Boy Advance that included The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords. While I don't usually include ports into these videos, the inclusion of 4 Swords kinda makes this release noteworthy. It was the first game in the series to feature multiplayer, which required you to play with 2 or more people. Personally, I don't really consider this a Zelda game, there really isn't much to talk about. I mean, I couldn't even play the fucking game, it requires at least 2 people! More importantly, this was the first version of A Link to the Past that I played, which kinda defined the way I see most Zelda games. Throughout the entire series, most of the handheld Zelda games have been done from the top-down perspective, and most of the console entries have been done in 3D, but this wasn't always the case. Whenever anyone talks about their favorite Zelda game, it's usually a discussion that involves all the 3D games, or A Link to the Past. I think a lot of people people put A Link to the Past as one of their favorite games in the series because they grew up with the home console version, and it's one of the best console games that features the top-down perspective. If I grew up with the SNES and played A Link to the Past, I would have seen it as some next level shit, but since I grew up with the 3D entries, I see it as something more on par with the handheld games. So when I played A Link to the Past for the first time, I didn't think of it as this amazing next-gen experience. I thought, wow, that was pretty good for the B tier shit. That's kind of fucked up, but that's just the way I see it. I grew up with Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and the 3D Zelda games are simply on a whole different level than any of the top-down Zelda games. In 2003, Nintendo released the next 3D Zelda game on the GameCube, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. The introduction of the game depicts the story from Ocarina of Time, where adult Link killed Ganon and was sent back in time. But since Link has essentially disappeared, Ganon eventually returned and the fate of the kingdom vanished into legend. The game takes place hundreds of years later, where people live on islands in the Great Sea, which is later revealed to be the fled remains of Hyrule. The initial goal of the game was to save Link's sister, who was kidnapped by a giant bird, but the events of the game quickly escalate to having to awaken the power of the Master Sword in order to kill Ganondorf. In order to do this, Link has to collect the 3 things in order to get the Master Sword fucking again, so he can eventually kill Ganondorf. One of the major changes to the game was a new cel-shaded art style. It was initially hated by fans because they wanted to see the graphical leap from Ocarina of Time. After Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask established a more mature tone, people quickly wrote off The Wind Waker as Nintendo catering the game to children. While I can understand the disappointment, I think Nintendo made the right decision, since The Wind Waker has aged better with time. Even today, it looks way better than Majora's Mask, and even looks better than some of the later games in the series. One of the major mechanics of The Wind Waker is sailing the Great Sea, which is the main method of transport for the entire game. While some people dislike sailing the ocean, I found it to be really fun. It allowed the world to feel incredibly large when compared to the previous games in the series. Being able to see silhouettes of islands out in the distance and traveling straight to them with no interruption in gameplay brings back the feeling of exploration that the 3D games were somewhat lacking. In order to travel the ocean, you would have to change the direction of the wind with the Wind Waker, which is an instrument similar to the ocarina. You would use the C stick to play certain notes and the analog stick to change the time signature, allowing you to conduct a variety of songs. One of the more interesting additions to the game are the dungeons that require you to control other characters. You can control Medli or Makar with the use of the command melody, which is required to solve puzzles in their respective dungeons. The gameplay is very similar to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, with some new additions. They added a contact-sensitive parry attack that can be used to counter enemy attacks, as well as the Hurricane Spin, which is an upgraded version of the spin attack that you can unlock later in the game. You can also use the C-stick to freely move your camera for the first time in the series, which really helps when you're trying to navigate the Great Sea. One of the more disappointing things about The Wind Waker was that there was clearly cut content. The initial goal of The Wind Waker is to obtain the 3 pearls to open up the Tower of the Gods. The game is set up to follow the established formula from A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, but The Wind Waker subverts this just slightly. Instead of going to a 3rd dungeon, Great Fish Isle ends up being completely destroyed. You then have to track down Jaboon by talking to the pirates at Windfall, and you obtain the 3rd pearl by sailing back to Outset Island. I can imagine that Great Fish Isle was supposed to be the home of another race, but they had to rush the game in order to release it on time. There's even some proof of this in the game, since the 3 islands you would have found each pearl reveal the shape of the Triforce. The outside points of the Triforce would be the islands where you do the 3 dungeons, where the inner points are the islands where you place each pearl to reveal the Tower of the Gods. The destruction of Great Fish Isle allowed them to remove the 3rd race from the game, the 3rd dungeon from the game, and possibly to remove another dungeon that would be required to awaken the power of the Master Sword. In order to compensate for cut content, they added in the Triforce hunting quest, which a lot of people didn't really enjoy. This entire part of the game requires you to hunt down 8 missing shards of the Triforce of Courage. Personally, I really love the Triforce hunting quest, but I can completely understand why some people dislike it. The whole problem with this part of the game is that it requires you to get a shit ton of rupees that you'll probably not have on your first playthrough. Since you have to pay Tingle money to make progress, this becomes a giant chore for a lot of people. It's fine if you still want to explore the islands, but if you just want to beat the game, it's a giant pain in the ass. While the cut content is kind of disappointing, it's still a very enjoyable game. The art style has aged better than most Zelda games, and it's incredibly fun to sail across the Great Sea and discover new islands. A year later, Nintendo released Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures for the GameCube. This is the actual 4 Swords game that everyone likes. While the original game felt like some experimental slapped-on gimmick to the port of A Link to the Past, this is the 4 Swords game that everyone talks about. The game acts as a sequel to the original 4 Swords, but both games are essentially the same exact story with some minor differences. All that really matters is that you have to stop the Wind Mage Vati from wreaking havoc havoc on Hyrule by grabbing the Force Sword, which splits Link into 4 different Links, and you eventually have to stop Ganon as well because he's in the fucking game for some reason. The main game takes place over 8 worlds, with each world having 3 stages, a minigame, and a boss fight. The goal of each stage was to reach the end of the level with 2,000 Force Gems. One of the gimmicks of Four Swords Adventure is that you have to use the Game Boy Advance connector to play with 2 or more people. While you spend most of the game playing on the TV screen, the game would sometimes switch to your Game Boy Advance screen, so you could explore an entire house or cave while everyone else was exploring stuff on the TV screen. It seems like a gimmick at first, but it allows each Link to wander off on their own, and without the Game Boy Advance, this game would be a giant clusterfuck. While the game has a focus on multiplayer, you can actually play the game by yourself. You can control all 4 Links by using a variety of battle formations, as well as being able to individually control 1 Link at a time. The single player is still enjoyable, but the game's at its best when you're playing with other people. The game will rank players based on how well they performed, which gives players an incentive to compete for Force Gems and other things they normally wouldn't care about. The game also intentionally allows players to attack each other and steal their Force Gems, and the fun of Four Swords Adventure is working together with your friends while also screwing them over at the same time. The contrast between single player and multiplayer is pretty drastic. The game is pretty simplistic when you're playing by yourself. The game isn't too challenging, you can move between areas at your own pace, and you're always in complete control. Playing the game with multiple people is a lot more challenging. You have to work together to solve puzzles, but then there's that one person who's not really cooperating with everyone else, and there's some dickhead burning everyone with a fire rod, and then you finally get to the end of the stage, but you don't have enough Force Gems because that dickhead with the fire rod kept killing everyone, and then you have to replay the stage, but right when you're about to win, that dickhead with the fire rod accidentally disconnects his Game Boy Advance connector, so you get booted out to the main menu and you have to start the whole fucking stage all over again. It's just a blast to play with friends. It's such a fun game. Four Swords Adventures kind of stands out as this weird multiplayer Zelda game that people don't really care about. It's honestly one of my favorite Zelda games, and it's just so much fucking fun. About a year later, Nintendo released the next handheld game for the Game Boy Advance, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. The story for this game acts as a prequel to the Four Swords series, establishing Vaati as the main villain and creating an origin for the Four Sword. The major gameplay mechanic of the Minish Cap is using Ezlo to shrink down to the size of the Minish, a brand new race that's exclusive to this game. While you're shrunk down, you can gain access to certain areas where the Minish are usually located. It's in these areas where the game can create environments with an extreme amount of detail, which really makes it stand out amongst other handheld Zelda games. The Minish Cap improved on Link's abilities by allowing him to roll, as well as being able to learn some optional sword techniques. While the previous games had 1 or 2 optional techniques you could learn, the Minish Cap has 7 optional sword techniques that you can learn throughout the game. Some of these sword techniques are locked away behind Kinstones, which are special artifacts that Link can find throughout the game. Once Link has acquired some Kinstones, he can fuse them together with other Kinstones to unlock secrets in the world. It's not too long since the game only has 6 dungeons, but it's still a pretty solid handheld game. It's a fun Zelda game that's not padded out with stupid bullshit, so if you haven't played it, you should check it out. In 2006, Nintendo finally released the next 3D Zelda game for the GameCube and the Wii, The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. After The Wind Waker was released, fans complained that the series should return back to a more mature tone with a more realistic art style. Basically, everyone just wanted Ocarina of Time with Majora's Mask's darker tone. So Nintendo's like, you want fucking Ocarina of Time again? Well, here you fucking go! The story of Twilight Princess is very loosely connected to Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time, but the addition of the Twilight Realm might as well mean that none of the previous games matter. It's not supposed to be a sequel to Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time. They basically just wanted to make Ocarina of Time again, so that's what they fucking did. The goal of the game is to save Hyrule from being consumed by the Twilight Realm and to eventually kill Zant, and also fucking Ganondorf, because he's apparently in the fucking game for some reason. In order to do this, Link has to collect the 3 things in order to get the Master Sword, but then he has to collect the 3 more things to eventually defeat Zant and Ganondorf. The main gameplay mechanic of Twilight Princess is that you play a part of the game as Wolf Link, who has as many abilities as one of the transformation masks in Majora's Mask. The whole reason that Link becomes a wolf in the first place is because he gets transformed whenever he enters the Twilight Realm. It's another fucking dual world mechanic once again, but this time it's slightly different. Basically, the Twilight Realm is like an alternate dimension in which the Hylians are transformed into spirits or monsters or some fucking shit. You have to restore the world by killing a bunch of stupid fucking bugs. Basically, they wanted an excuse to make the game really dark and edgy. I mean, this game's rated T, so watch the fuck out. This game's fucking hardcore. Gameplay wise, it plays exactly the same as the previous 3D entries in the series, with some minor additions. Optional sword techniques have been carried over from the Minish Cap, with Link's 3D moveset being slightly more fleshed out. It doesn't make much of a difference since none of these moves are required to defeat enemies, but at least adds some more variety. While the game wants you to think that's an incredibly dark game, it mostly comes off as a bit obnoxious. Majora's Mask worked incredibly well because it was very subtle, where Twilight Princess shoves dark imagery down the player's throat and begs you to take it seriously. One of the best things about Twilight Princess is that it's very solid. The dungeons are extremely good, and once you get out of the long introduction, it's a really fun game straight to the very end. If the goal was to just make a shiny updated version of Ocarina of Time, well, they earned themselves a fucking A+, because that's exactly what Twilight Princess is. It's very similar to Ocarina of Time, but Ocarina of Time was one of the greatest games of all time, so it's not like that's a bad thing. In 2007, Nintendo released the next handheld Zelda game on the Nintendo DS, The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass. While it's the first handheld Zelda game to be in 3D, it still retains the top-down perspective. The story of the game takes place shortly after the events of the Wind Waker. The goal of the game is to save Tetra, who ends up getting trapped on the Ghost Ship. In order to save Tetra, Link has to travel across the Great Sea to find the spirits of the three things, which will help him find the Ghost Ship, but then he has to collect the three more things, so Link can get the Phantom Sword and kill Bellum. One of the major changes to the game was the new way you control Link. You can perform all of Link's basic actions with a simple movement of the DS stylus, which works way better than you think it would. Sailing from the Wind Waker makes a return to this game, but it's done in a slightly different way. Basically, you just draw a line on your sea chart and your boat follows the path of the line. It's kind of boring, but it works. It's not that big of a deal. The main mechanic of Phantom Hourglass is that you have to revisit the same dungeon like 4 times in order to get sea charts. The developers essentially did a roundtable discussion on the worst fucking gameplay mechanic they could think of and just put that into the game. They created a dungeon that requires you to revisit it multiple times, that also has invincible enemies and requires you to use stealth. But to add to the fun, they also added a fucking arbitrary time limit for really no fucking reason. On top of all this, you find every sea chart further and further into this dungeon, but all the puzzles reset once you leave. So every time you revisit this dungeon, you have to do all the old puzzles all over again. So after the 3rd or 4th time of having to do all the same shit over and over again, I just dropped the fucking game and never beat it. This game fucking sucks! They followed it up 2 years later with Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. I didn't even fucking play this game. Like, Phantom Hourglass sucks so much dick that I couldn't even bother playing this one. It's basically a sequel to Phantom Hourglass, but like now you're controlling like a fucking train now. Like, that's fine, I guess. Apparently the central dungeon for this game doesn't suck dick because they removed the time limit and made it so you don't have to constantly repeat the same puzzles. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't really fucking know, and I don't really fucking care. At the end of the day, both these games are just B-tier shit, and I honestly have no investment. As long as they don't fuck up the 3D installments of the series, I really couldn't care less. And what do you fucking know? In 2011, Nintendo released Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, which is one of the most disappointing Zelda games I've ever played. The story for this game acts as a prequel to every other Zelda game in existence. At this point in time, Nintendo actually created an official timeline for the Hyrule Historia, but it's basically complete bullshit. The timeline doesn't really matter, because every game in the Zelda series was designed to be its own story. Even with the creation of the timeline, Skyward Sword has absolutely no impact on any of the events of the other games, so I don't even know why they bothered. The goal of the game was to save Zelda and to eventually kill Demise, but he's actually fucking Gandorf, but they just called him Demise. In order to do this, Link has to travel to the 3 places to get the 3 things, so he can get another 3 things at the same 3 places, which will allow him to get the other 3 things at the same 3 places and eventually kill Demise. One of the major additions of Skyward Sword was the addition of the Wii Motion Plus. Link will swing his sword in whatever direction you swing your remote, which means the combat received a major overhaul. Most of the combat revolves around Link circumventing his opponent's guard by swinging the sword in the right direction. It's interesting at first, but it quickly becomes repetitive as time goes on. This is also the first game that includes a stamina meter. Running and climbing objects will consume part of Link's stamina, which will eventually recover over time. Another minor change was having upgradable equipment. You can visit the scrap shop and upgrade certain items by using treasures that you find while playing the game. While a lot of people disliked the motion controls, I disliked the game for a ton of other reasons, mainly the lack of exploration and the reuse of old areas. I was initially really excited for Skyward Sword because it seemed to take place in the sky, which looked like it would have been a great follow-up to the Wind Waker. Instead of sailing the ocean on a sailboat, it could have been Link on a loft wing exploring the sky. I eventually became extremely extremely disappointed because the sky ended up being just a slapped-on gimmick. The sky is completely empty and devoid of any content, besides the main town in the center and a couple of islands that have mini-games. The rest of the islands have chests that can only be unlocked by hitting goddess cubes on the surface, so there's absolutely no incentive to explore the sky. Skyward Sword takes some inspiration from Phantom Hourglass in the sense that it doesn't understand the core values of Zelda. Zelda games used to be all about open-ended exploration and freedom, but Skyward Sword constantly tramples on this by recycling old content and forcing you to go through it all. Skyloft is essentially an overworld hub where you can decide to go to either Faron Woods, Eldin Volcano, or Lanayru Desert, and every area on the surface is extremely linear and offers little variety. There is so little content in this game that it almost feels like they ran out of time in development, but considering it was the longest development period in the history of the franchise, this clearly wasn't the case. So what the fuck happened? Well, to put this into perspective, let's start off by talking about Nintendo and the Wii. To put it bluntly, the Wii is one of the worst consoles that Nintendo has ever put out. While it was a financial success, a lot of the games that Nintendo put out on the system were complete garbage. The earlier years of the Wii were very good, with the release of Twilight Princess and Super Mario Galaxy, but these games were in development long before Nintendo realized how profitable the Wii would become. After the Wii became a mainstream success, Nintendo began to pander to the fucking idiots that only bought the system for fucking Wii Sports. For years, Nintendo rested on their laurels putting out mediocre trash to sell to the masses, and Skyward Sword was just another failed attempt to try to win over the casual market. I think Skyward Sword could have been a great game, but Nintendo intentionally dumbed down the game to make it more accessible. They made the map smaller so players wouldn't get lost, they increased the linearity of the game, and they constantly reused areas and bosses to make the game easier for inexperienced players. You have to remember that this is the same company that included a fucking DVD tutorial with Super Mario Galaxy 2 to teach idiots how to play the game. So of course, Skyward Sword comes out, none of these idiots even play the game, it turns out to be fucking garbage, and critics rate it 10 out of 10 regardless of the actual quality. I mean, the game turned out okay, it's passable, but I waited fucking 5 years for this? What a fucking joke. Needless to say, Nintendo got a huge fucking kick in the ass. These idiots aren't buying Nintendo's games, the longtime fans are getting screwed over with this mediocre shit, and it's all because Nintendo is dumbing down all their games for these idiots. They eventually released the 3DS and the Wii U, adding in stupid gimmicks that no one asked for, and it seemed like no one knew what the fuck Nintendo was doing. But suddenly, Nintendo had this revelation of ray of light shine down from fucking heaven, and they finally realized that maybe people buy video game consoles to play good video games. Weird, right? So in 2013, Nintendo finally pulled their head out of their ass and released Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds for the 3DS. The game acts as a sequel to A Link to the Past, featuring a very similar world as the previous game. The goal of the game was to save Princess Zelda and to stop Yuga from reviving Ganon. In order to do this, Link has to get the 3 things in order to get the Master Sword, so he can save the descendants of the 7 sages and defeat Yuga. This game is really good because it finally broke away from the formula established by A Link to the Past. It breaks the modern Zelda conventions by reintroducing the old ones. One of the groundbreaking returns to this game was that you could finally do the dungeons in whatever order you wish. A major gameplay mechanic added to the game was being able to rent all your items. You can spend rupees to get whatever items you need, but if you die, you lose all the items you borrowed. This is one of the best additions because now you have the freedom to get whatever you want right at the beginning of the game. Another new addition was the ability to merge into walls. While in this form, Link can traverse areas that he normally wouldn't be able to reach, which is mostly used to solve puzzles as well as gain access to Lorule. Lorule is the Dark World equivalent of A Link to the Past, but it has its own little twist on it. The world is essentially a mirrored version of Hyrule, with every character in the game having their own doppelganger that contrasts their own personality. It's a modern Zelda game that finally remembers what Zelda used to be all about. It's a nice blend of open-ended exploration and puzzle solving, with some fun dungeons that you can do in whatever order you wish. In 2015, Nintendo released Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes, attempting to reinvent the Four Swords series. It was a multiplayer Zelda game that played with 3 Links instead of 4, supporting local and online multiplayer. The game acts as a sequel to A Link Between Worlds, but since the game takes place in Hytopia, it's essentially its own story. Basically, Hytopia is a city obsessed with fashion, and the whole point of the game is to save Princess Styla because she gets cursed to wear an irremovable ugly jumpsuit? What the fuck? Is this for fucking real? I commend Nintendo for attempting to make another multiplayer Zelda game, but nowadays it's just not gonna work. The fun of Four Swords Adventure was that you were playing with each other in the same room. Playing through the game with 3 incompetent friends is a complete fucking nightmare, but it's fun, because it's an experience that you can share with your buddies. Online co-op is never going to match the frantic environment of 4 friends screaming in front of a TV. Even worse, having to communicate with random players online can be a bit frustrating. While I enjoy the occasional fuckhead who burns everyone with the fire rod, sometimes you just need to get your shit together so you can move on to the next level. After a while, you just have to look over to your buddy and tell him to stop fucking around. The problem with playing online is that it lacks the human element. I mean, when my buddy is being a dipshit in Four Swords Adventures, I can just frag that bitch with a fucking Game Boy Advance. If someone's being annoying online, you just have to suck it up or disconnect from the game. So as someone who's played Four Swords Adventures, I avoided this game like the fucking plague. I didn't give a fuck. The single player didn't look too appealing either, just because there didn't seem to be any formations like in Four Swords Adventures, which seems like a complete oversight. Every character also shares the same health, which seems like the worst fucking idea you could come up with. There were some interesting mechanics like the outfits and the totem formation, but it didn't seem that interesting. Like I said before, if they put out bad handheld games, I don't really care. It was an experiment that didn't really work out. But that's fine, because at least Nintendo is trying to do different shit. And thank fucking God for that, because in 2017, we got a brand new 3D Zelda game for the Wii U and the Switch, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is the best fucking Zelda game I've played in years for the history of the entire franchise. We've had the top-down Zelda games inspired by Zelda 1, and we had the 3D Zelda games inspired by Ocarina of Time. But this is some next level shit. It just removes all the modern bullshit from the 3D Zelda games and retains all the amazing shit from the classic Zelda games. Breath of the Wild is the first game in a very long time to give you the freedom to explore the world at your own pace. The game immediately starts at a fucking breakneck pace and gives you everything you need within an hour and a half. You get your map, sword, shield, bow, bombs, magnesis, stasis, cryosis, and your paraglider, and just go! Just fucking go! Well, where's the forest dungeon? Don't have to do that one first. Shut the fuck up! Just go anywhere! Do whatever you want! This game is so much fun. It's the most fun I've ever had in a Zelda game. Combat is similar to the previous games, but they added so many mechanics that it feels like a completely different game. You got your one-handed sword, your two-handed sword, your spears, your shields, and your bows with a wide variety of different arrows to fire. You can parry attacks with your shield to reflect projectiles. You can perform perfect dodges to perform a flurry of attacks. You can get slow motion when you fire your arrows in mid-air. You can use your shields to surf down a fucking mountain. You can use your paraglider to catch an upward gust of air, and the list just goes on and on. The game's just fucking jam-packed with all sorts of shit, and it never gets old. The stamina system has been brought over from Skyward Sword, which works perfectly with the combat and the exploration. Stamina is mostly spent while you're sprinting, swimming, or climbing up giant fucking mountains. Another major mechanic added into the game was the ability to gather resources in the environment and cook them into useful meals. There are a wide variety of recipes that can heal your hearts or add a status effect like increasing your movement speed. You can craft specific meals that will allow you to overcome challenges you normally wouldn't be ready for, like temporarily increasing your maximum hearts to fight a tough enemy. Since this game has once again removed recovery hearts, your main source of health is usually from food. The game also has a ton of armor sets that all have their own benefits. They don't make much of a difference at first, but then you find special sets that give you passive abilities, and you can also upgrade your armor to gain an additional set bonus if you wear the full set. The game also added in a temperature gauge that will change depending on the weather. If Link is too cold or hot, he'll end up taking damage until he dies. This can usually be negated by equipping a proper set of armor or by eating certain kinds of foods. Dungeons have also received a major overhaul, with most of the dungeons being represented as shrines. A shrine is essentially a small mini dungeon that you can find while you're exploring, and completing the shrine will reward Link with a spirit orb. These orbs are basically this game's equivalent of heart pieces. When you get 4 spirit orbs, you can pray at a goddess statue and receive a heart container to upgrade your health, or a stamina vessel to upgrade your stamina. One of the more overlooked additions of Breath of the Wild is that the game is running on a physics engine. This allows the puzzles to have multiple solutions, since players can use the physics engine to their advantage. Puzzle solving in Zelda games have always been very rigid. You would usually have to push a specific block on a grid or stand in a very specific place and hit a switch, but Breath of the Wild gives you the freedom to solve puzzles in a variety of ways. Even if you complete these puzzles in unintended ways, it still makes you feel smart, because you discovered a unique solution completely on your own. Breath of the Wild embodies discovery and freedom unlike any Zelda game I've ever played. The main story is completely optional, the shrines are completely optional, and you can just go fight Ganon right at the beginning of the game. You can do whatever you want, and you can avoid whatever you want. The most fun I've ever had in the previous Zelda games was usually near the end of the game when I had all my items. Once you can solve all the puzzles, you can finally start to explore the world without getting stuck. One of the more obvious examples is with the Wind Waker. The Great Sea eventually opens up and allows you to explore, but since you don't have all of your items, you can't complete some of the puzzles on certain islands. It can be pretty disappointing when you show up to an island without the item required to solve a certain puzzle, which is why it's only fun to explore the Great Sea near the end of the game. Breath of the Wild subverts this entire problem by just giving you all of Link's equipment right at the beginning of the game. If you see a crack in a wall, you don't have to backtrack to the area after you get your bombs. If you want to do a shrine quest that requires the bow, you don't have to play the game for 7 hours until the game finally decides to give you one. The freedom that this game provides almost makes me despise the earlier 3D entries in the series, because all I can think about are the moments where these games could have given me more freedom, but they didn't. While the Zelda series has been built up on the freedom of open-ended exploration, these games don't play off this in the slightest. Sure, you can travel to wherever you want, but you have to do the dungeons in a very specific order, you're a slave to the main story, and most of the exploration opens up at the end of the game. It's like I've been brought up playing this butchered version of Zelda my entire life. Now, as much as I love this game, Breath of the Wild isn't flawless. Even with the latest patch, the game has some frame rate problems, especially in certain areas that have a ton of foliage. Never happened enough to ruin my experience, but it happens enough to be noticeable. Some people also don't like the durability on your weapons, which can be a little obnoxious early on in the game. Your weapons can break incredibly fast if you're just hack and slashing your way through enemies, but I never really found it to be a problem. The open-ended nature of the game also made the music feel kind of bland. The game has some heightened moments where the music will stand out, but it's only done in cutscenes or specific areas in the game. I still enjoy the music overall, but it definitely doesn't have the same impact as the previous entries in the series. The removal of heart pieces also made the side quests feel less important to complete, but that's more of a minor nitpick. Overall, it's fucking amazing. It's one of the best Zelda games I've ever played. You could literally buy the Switch just for this game and the purchase would be worth it. The Legend of Zelda is an amazing series of games. After 30 years, the Zelda series has continued to create new experiences that still feel fresh, while also creating games that feel distinctively Zelda. While the Zelda series is very consistent, the developers have always been willing to make some changes throughout the years. Sometimes those changes will end up disappointing certain players, but it's not too long until they end up getting the game they wanted. Even with those disappointments, the series has given us some of the best video games I've ever played. While I love a lot of these games, I want Nintendo to continue to create new experiences. I can already see a lot of people wanting Nintendo to make a Majora's Mask version of Breath of the Wild, but I feel like that would be a mistake. One of the reasons that Majora's Mask was so special was because no one was asking for it. After Ocarina of Time was released, people weren't begging Nintendo to put in a 3-day cycle or transformation masks. They did it because it fit the game they wanted to make. The reason that Breath of the Wild is so good is because it broke out of the creative restraints of Ocarina of Time. Don't get me wrong, I love Ocarina of Time, but after almost 15 years of the same game, it gets kind of old. The reason I love Breath of the Wild so much is because it was different. I love the transformation masks in Majora's Mask because it was different. I love the sailing in the Wind Waker because it was different. The most exciting thing about Legend of Zelda is that I don't really know what the next game is going to be. There's always going to be a new story worth telling, and there's always going to be a new gameplay mechanic that's worth trying out. It's been a series of games that I've played for my entire life, and I hope that I can continue playing it. Legend of Zelda is simply classic.